Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today I'm filming my weekly roundup. I don't know why I did that like a wrestler announcement, like roundup. Um, my weekly roundup of the books I've been reading this week. Apologies, the camera is a little bit dark because I live in the UK, and every time I try and like film something when there's a bit of sunshine, it automatically just turns to a cloud again. So that's lovely. Anyway, here is what I read this week, and you'll notice again it's sort of dominated a bit by some prizes, but also quite a fun one in terms of reading a few smaller indie books. And also just really having a chance to sort of read some other bits. So now that book is sort of, well, now that I've read the book along list, I'm sort of slowly finishing off the shortlists from some other prizes, which I'm almost done with, and then I'm sort of slowly peppering in some other bits of reading as well. Anyway, that's a lot of preamble. Let's get started on the books. So first up, I read two books about insects that were both shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize for nature writing, for global conservation. And those were The Insect Crisis by Oliver Milman and also Silent Earth by Dave Goulson. And what's kind of quite interesting I found with these books is one of them I was listening to on audio, one of them I was reading in a sort of, on paper. And at one point they sort of converged where I was listening to one on audio and, I was reading them at the same time basically. And they're both about insects. They both deal with very similar topics. And actually they both quote each other in terms of the two authors being quoted quite regularly throughout the book. They quote similar studies. They're not the same book, but they do have quite a lot of crossover, and that's always quite fun and interesting to see. So first up, The Insect Crisis. So this largely looks at how the collapse of insects and of insect populations has a massive knock-on effect to populations basically on humans in some way, shape or form. So either by affecting other animals, which then affect birds, or whether that is about pollination, whether that's about various other things, it does massively affect the world that we live in. And although they're not always seen as like the nicest things, people often feel a bit squeamish about certain types of insects. I think this book puts forward a really strong argument for how we approach it. And I think this book in particular focuses a bit more on not necessarily doom and gloom. That's not fair to the book, but it paints a bit more of a picture of what collapse actually looks like. And Silent Earth itself, despite having the subtitle of Averting the Insect Apocalypse, actually takes a slightly more hopeful tone at times as well. And like I've sort of found with many other books, the sort of level of dad jokes or sort of veering on dad jokes going on in this book was a sort of a big draw for me as well. And Dave Goulson talks a lot in this book about some of the same things as in The Insect Crisis. But he also looks a little bit more at some of the insects that we might traditionally overlook. So actually, we often think of things like flies as being sheer nuisances. And actually, he talks a lot about how they play a really important role, not only in terms of clearing away bits of debris or little kind of things, but actually often are pollinators for certain plants as well. He talks quite a lot similarly about things like dung beetles, which again don't seem like the most exciting thing from the outskirts, but he talks about actually how in a farm in in Australia at one point there were huge issues where European cattle had been brought over to Australia. They became quite populous, but actually that meant that there was suddenly a lot of cow dung around, and local dung beetles weren't the right type for it. So essentially they then brought over South African dung beetles because they were a similar climate, and it all worked. And actually it's weird to think that we basically, as a sort of society, have a sort of global society, have sort of moved quite a lot of things around the world, but haven't necessarily brought the systems with them. And I think this book is really interesting for looking at that, at kind of how we can connect those dots as well. So both books I thought were really, really interesting, and I learned a great deal from them both. And it was quite useful as well that they sort of crossed over so much, because I have a terrible memory. So in many ways it was useful for reminding me what the other book had just said. And I really do recommend them. I think they're both fascinating books at looking at an area that we don't really think about too much all the time. And just really interesting. Next up, I read The Last White Man by Mohsin Hamid. And this is, I've read a previous book of his, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, which I loved. I was really keen to read this when it came out. It sounded really exciting and really interesting. And I found it just such a captivating book. So the premise of this book is that one day our sort of main character, Anders, wakes up no longer a white man, but instead wakes up as a black man. This is quite confusing for him, as you may guess. It's kind of quite a big change for him, and a lot for him to try and wrap his head around. But actually, soon, almost like Saramago, Jose Saramago, actually, there's this sort of thing where it's this sort of thought experiment where everybody slowly starts changing, sort of miraculously overnight. And so we are eventually left with one person who is the last white man. And it ends up just being a really engaging book that talks a lot about what some of those nuances are around the way that we talk about race, the way we talk about identity in the book. So, for example, there's a moment later in the book where one of the characters is thinking about their future children and suddenly has the realization that because they have now turned black and their partner has turned black, what will happen with their child? Will their child be born white and then turn black? Will the child be born black? And there's this sort of thing threaded through about what that then means for their identity. And I think this book is really quite interesting for how it sort of skewers some of those what's the word, some of those sort of insecurities some people have around their place within society, and kind of finds a way of really amping that up to the max in this sort of bizarre thought experiment of a book. It's a really short book and a really quick read, I found, and I was just really taken by the point of view of this book. It has a really strong voice that I think carries this book really strongly. And I think this could have just been almost like an essay of a thought experiment. This could have been a sort of a much longer novel. And I think actually there's something so tight and focused and urgent about this book, which I really greatly enjoyed. And now increasingly, because I think I'd heard about it, it'd been a book that had been sort of floated as a potential for the book along list, and now I can't help but think actually this would have been a really fun addition to the list. And you know, he's been shortlisted twice before, so it wouldn't have been out of the question. But yeah, really engaging and exciting read, and I'm really keen to hear more people's thoughts about it, because I just think it was just so playful, but also so skillfully managed as a book. I think this could have very easily fallen into some sort of bad places, or it could have been very generic. And I think actually this book works on many levels. Next up, I read a couple of short books from some indie presses. The first one is The Last One by Fatima Daas, a translated book, and it is originally sort of written from the perspective of Fatima herself. It kind of is almost auto-fiction. It's quite a blurred line, but essentially she grows up in a banlieue of Paris, so sort of a suburb. But the one that she grows up in is sort of one that's actually quite renowned for being this kind of almost forgotten area of Paris. It's sort of just far enough outside that it basically never really gets the sort of feeling, you know, it's very distant. The people there often don't leave that neighborhood quite as much, and so it's an area that's sort of fairly poor. It's an area where lots of new migrants to France are often sent, and so it has this sort of forgotten about, left alone kind of identity. And I think it is mentioned as well in the wonderful book by Jonny, whose name I've entirely forgotten the name of now. Afropean, I think it is. Yes. Which is a really fascinating book in itself, which goes into sort of diaspora communities across Europe. And that is mentioned in that book in a way of this sort of this area that actually has almost all the cards stacked against it, but is an incredibly resilient neighborhood regardless. Anyway, all of that's background, but Fatima Daas in this book talks a lot about her identity, not only as a Muslim woman, but also a queer Muslim woman who is whose sort of family are Algerian, but she herself is born and raised in France. So there's this sort of identity kind of crisis she often has, where she'll meet her Algerian cousins, and they'll sort of see her as not being quite Algerian, but a lot of French people don't see her as necessarily being French, and it's this sort of in-between stage, and then the kind of intersections of her gender, her sexuality and religion, and how a lot of those things interplay. But every chapter begins with, "My name is Fatima Daas," and then she'll then go on to some kind of sort of tangent off of her name. So Fatima being sort of one of the first women, sort of a woman who's sort of held in high regard within Islam. But then she'll also talk about, for example, my name is Fatima Daas and I'm Algerian but also French. And then she'll do a sort of a thing talking about her identity there. And it's really fascinating how she threads these things together. It shouldn't really work at times as a book. It should sound almost too repetitive and sing-songy. But for me, it really worked because there was something so consistent about that voice that I thought was really beautiful. And it's a voice that we don't really get quite as much of in literature. So really, really interesting, and a very quick read as well, a very, very short book. But I think it's really well worth looking at. I think it's a really cleverly done book. And last but not least, I read My Dead Book by Nate Lippens. And this is a book sort of largely focused on it's sort of that almost like typical kind of, not typical, but that kind of American novel almost of, you know, people who are a bit down and out, who are kind of the marginalized and excluded from society, and how they sort of battle various things around them. But it's done through quite an interesting lens, because it's done through a couple of men, two of, you know, both of whom are sex workers. And so it kind of explores it through the lens of what it is to be almost this sort of a gay man who's almost been promised this sort of utopia of being a gay man in the US and having, you know, being close to all of the really exciting things that are happening and the big scenes and everything else like that. But then actually what that looks like when your finances are fairly insecure, when you're working, when you're doing sex work, when, for example, there are issues around drugs and alcohol. And it sort of just becomes this haze of a novel. It's, again, very, very short, but this real sort of almost drug trip of a novel that at times I just found really compelling. Didn't always work for me. Occasionally I think I sort of lost the thread of it a little bit, but really daring and interesting as a book. And I was quite excited by that it just sort of felt like it had that kind of grit that often you don't always sort of get in novels necessarily about the queer experience, where sometimes it's a bit more sanitized. And so I think this was so kind of like gnarled and gritty, and yeah, it was really, really good fun. I think, if not always the easiest to read, because it's sort of quite grim at times as a result of that. So anyway, those have been the books I've read this week, which I've really greatly enjoyed. A nice, interesting mix of insects, a sort of road novel, and this novel set in a French suburb. Anyway, I've been Bothered Booker. I hope you've had a wonderful week of reading, and just generally, I hope it's less rainy there than it is here. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.